Welcome to week 2 of our Lent study series, where we're focusing on the events of the last 7 days of Jesus' earthly life. We're invited to step into his story, to walk with him on the journey that leads to the cross. Today we're on the Monday of that last week. I've called it Meltdown Monday, but I'm putting a question mark after that phrase. Was it really Meltdown Monday? Had Jesus got out of bed the wrong side that morning, or suddenly regressed into childhood? Or was something else going on here that he wants us to understand? What do you think is more likely? I have to be honest, the 2 stories that Mark captures for us today have always left me with questions. After all, what had the poor fig tree done to deserve Jesus cursing it? And then there's what happened in the temple with him turning over the tables. What's that about? If you haven't read it yet, then pause the video and go and read Mark's Gospel, chapter 11, verses 12 to 19. Mark 11, verses 12 to 19. So verse 12. The next day, Monday, as they were leaving Bethany, Jesus was hungry. Seeing a fig tree in leaf, he went to find out if it had any fruit. Daft really when you think about it. Look at the second part of verse 13 and you'll see why. Mark tells us something significant that begins to help us to look at things differently. Mark says in verse 13, it was not the season for figs. So why did Jesus go looking for them? After all, we wouldn't go looking for conkers in February, would we? Or daffodils in November. Think about it. Jesus would have known it wasn't the right season. This is Mark's way of telling us that something else is going on here. The fig tree is just an illustration to make a point. There were plenty of leaves, but no fruit. In other words, it was all show. And then there was the temple. There was plenty going on there too, we can see that. Money changing, bird selling, excessive rules about what and where things could happen, who could come in and who couldn't. It was all show. And Mark was clever. He puts these 2 stories together in order that he has done to show us for a reason. He often did that, arranging them in such a way that we interpret one in the light of the other, in order to emphasize the teaching that comes immediately afterwards. That's how we know that it's important. Let me show you what I mean. You see, it would be easy to get stuck on the fig tree incident, Jesus cursing it, and completely miss the point that Jesus was trying to make. Equally, we could get stuck on what happened in the temple, and we often do, with him turning over the tables, and we miss the point. But the point was the same both times. You see, the fig tree was barren, fruitless. Mark tells us that. And Jesus curses it. It was an indictment on the tree. He cursed it so that it would never produce figs again. It would just wither and die, which is exactly what happened the next day if we were to read on. Now this is what we need to know. You see, in the Bible, the fig tree is a metaphor, a picture, if you like, that represents Jerusalem itself, or the temple to be precise. That's what this is all about. And that's where Mark takes us next. Like I said, there was plenty going on in the temple, just like with the leaves on the tree. Except, and here comes the point, it was all pretty empty. Meaningless, you could say. It was all show. Plenty of leaves, but no fruit. When he turned over the tables, Jesus was effectively doing to the temple what he'd done earlier to the tree, warning that it too would one day be destroyed. In order to understand how cutting this was, we first need to get to grips with how the Jews saw the temple. They saw it as the dwelling place of God. It was critically important to them. It was the epicenter of their religious beliefs. But if God was really dwelling there, if there was evidence of the kingdom fruit that Jesus had so often taught about, the fruit that comes from a right relationship with God, then he could have expected to see it there. Instead, there was something else. The temple had become a hiding place, a den for those who exploited others, the poor and widows. There was no love in that. And the Jewish leaders were getting away with it, apparently in the name of God. Jesus' problem was not so much with the business of money changing or selling animals for sacrifice. Believe it or not, they were actually legitimate activities for the temple to function. Now, what he was so angry about was the way in which the religious authorities dominated the place, controlling the outer courts as a marketplace, the very place that should have been a prayer for all nations, a place of prayer, for all nations, and the only place designated for the Gentiles to have access to God through prayer. In effect, they robbed people of a place to pray. The inner courts were for the Jewish elite only. It was their power base. What's more, the poorest people were being exploited. The Jewish leaders, well, they were making a mint, flirting with the Romans, believing they could get away with anything because as long as God was in the temple, they would be safe. Wrong. Just as he'd shut down the fig tree, Jesus now effectively shut down the temple, or his actions hinted that that would be the case, that it would be destroyed. They had what was coming to them, as my mother would have said. In reality, what Jesus did that day was to turn over a few tables. That was all. There was no intervention by the temple guards. He wasn't arrested. But for the Jewish leaders, it was a sign from Jesus that he meant business, a shot over their bows. And he goes on to give them a bit of Old Testament prophecy to explain what he meant. In verse 17, he quotes from Jeremiah. Jesus effectively said to them, what you're doing here is nothing new. When you follow other gods, when you oppress others, when you get smug and think you're safe, that you'll get away with what you want, then you're barking up the wrong tree. Jeremiah told you that 500 years ago. Why aren't you listening? Has this house become a den of robbers to you? I have been watching, declares the Lord. I have been watching. That was the exact verse that Jesus quoted to them. Oh, they stood there looking all self-righteous, but all the while their hearts were stained. Their worship was empty and meaningless. Jeremiah had warned the Israelite people all those years before that God would only continue to dwell with them if they stopped oppressing the poor, if they stopped going after other gods, if they amended their ways. Jesus' action on that Monday morning were about shutting down the temple, were about God ceasing to dwell with them. It couldn't have been a stronger warning. Ouch. Two scenes, the fig tree and the temple. Both looked pretty healthy from a distance, but a closer inspection revealed their true condition. Let me just ask this for a minute. What do our lives look like from a distance? And what do they look like close up? This Lent, we have an opportunity to look again at our lives through the lens of the Jesus story. Are you producing fruit? Or are you good at giving that impression? Are our actions consistent with our faith? Do people see Jesus in and through what we do with our lives, or are they prevented from seeing him because our experience over this last year has gone a bit stale? When we finally get back to worshipping together, and that day will come, when we finally get back to worshipping together, will our churches be exclusive, just the way we like it? Will we rush to protect things the way that we've always done them? Or will we listen to where God might be leading us? To try new things perhaps? To open up our churches, our lives? You see, our lives are his temple. We are the dwelling place of God. And if we're focused on the wrong things in our lives, well, we won't flourish. People won't enjoy the fruit. They won't see Jesus. We'll be guilty of robbing them of that opportunity. When we fail to nurture our spiritual life, when we get lazy about it and Jesus slips into second place or lower behind, say, Netflix or Facebook, we're denying ourselves that fruit, and we're denying God himself. No wonder God's heart breaks sometimes. No wonder Jesus turns the table over and curses the fig tree. As we move through this last week, let what happened on that Monday, Meltdown Monday, speak into our hearts and lives. And right now, right where you are, invite Jesus to reveal what you might need to change.